I'm keenly interested in each and every human being that comes within the reach of my voice.
Hello, I'm John J. Thompson, and when I'm not working on this podcast with my compatriot Bruce Brown, or being a professor of music industry studies at Lipscomb University here in Nashville, one of the other things you might find me doing is writing. I write a lot. Over the last 30 years, I have written thousands of record reviews, articles, commentaries, and more. I've even written a few books. My latest book, as you may have heard, is my first novel. It's a story about music and community and relationships and struggle and a lot more. I've been working on The Ballad of the Lost Dogs of East Nashville for over 10 years, actually, and as we now have a special early edition available in print, digital, and audio formats, we thought a special episode of the podcast was in order. I recently had a chance to take the stage at a small combination record store and pub right here in my own East Nashville neighborhood to talk about the book, read a bit from it, and take some questions from some of the folks who backed it on Kickstarter. I invited Father Preston Sharpe, the pastor of the Anglican church Michelle and I have been attending for the last couple of years, to have a conversation with me about the book since he is one of the few who I know has read it. I also took a trip up to my old stomping grounds, Wheaton, Illinois, and made a stop at the Wheaton Public Library for an event hosted by my good friend and one of my favorite music journalists, Jeff Elbel. Jeff writes for the Chicago Sun-Times, the Illinois Entertainer, and occasionally even TrueTunes.com, and also is an accomplished musician, songwriter, and producer in his own right. And Wheaton is where my career got started almost 40 years ago. It's where the original True Tunes store, concert venue, and magazine were based, where my band played many of our first shows, and a lot more. What you will hear is a combination of questions and answers from both events, the launch party at Vinyl Tap in East Nashville and the gathering at the Wheaton Library.
One of the things that's funny about the people, so what kind of book, what genre is this? And I don't even know what to tell people. So I'm going to ask you the first question.
Okay.
Like, you've read it. What genre would you say this book is?
Oh, gosh. Okay. So it's a fiction story, of course, but it's interesting because there's some semi-autobiography here, I think, that weaves through. As with every fiction story, there's some elements of John that I see in here and some backstory that I kind of fill in the gaps there. And it's inspirational. I think the word that keeps coming to mind for me is it's textured. There's like layers to this story. When I first read the book or heard the book, it was beautiful story, amazing story. There's layers to it. All these layers kind of come together. So he kind of pulls all these threads and then they kind of come together in this beautiful, I guess, music, like symphony kind of thing. But also then there's things that come back to you. So it's like, okay, there's a layer there that I missed, or there was this note here that I missed. And so I love this, man. I mean, this was, you can tell it's a labor of love. That's something that you put a lot into. It's not hard to read. So that's the thing. Sometimes when you pick up books, you go, okay, when am I going to get into this? But it's a natural story that flows really well. And then I love it takes place here in East Nashville. We'll talk more about that. So here. One question I had for you, you talk about the dogs thing and how that came to your mind, how that kind of drew you to this. But you had never published fiction before, right?
Correct. This is my third full book, but my first novel I read.
So talk to us a little bit about how it all came together, like came out of you.
So, Jordan, who's hiding behind the merch table right now, was with me and a group of friends on a backpacking trip. It's about 10 years ago. And when you get a bunch of millennials and whatever his generation is behind the millennials, without access to phones or screens, after backpacking up, it was Frozen Head State Park. After backpacking up the hill or the mountain and getting the fires lit, there's nothing else to do. And I think it was Jordan, it might have been somebody else that said, hey, if I had just finished my previous book, Jesus, Bread, and Chocolate, and somebody said, I think it was Jordan, if you were to try to talk about some of these ideas, but in story form, how would you do it? And Jordan grew up, I used to tell the kids stories at bedtime that I would just make up extemporaneously. And so I basically felt like I was telling a group of a dozen people a bedtime story around a campfire at the top of a mountain, and it was just fun. And so I thought about, like, the previous book was about how some things can get so big, music, chocolate, beer. I used these different things, and I dove deep into those things and said they get so big that they undermine their very identity. Like, they become more corporate and more artificial. And so I thought, well, what do I know most? I know most music. I've been in the music business, and I've been a songwriter and artist my whole life. So I'm gonna start with that. And I started telling a story about a band, in quotes, that didn't even really want to be a band. It was like an accidental band formed out of community, but that it became so popular that it potentially compromised its own essence. And just sitting around the fire telling it. Then the next night I told a little bit more of the story. And then on the drive home, I had to drive, and I was so tired that I couldn't even listen to music. I mean, backpacking for 2 days and sleeping on the ground, hadn't gotten great sleep. And so I said, I got to keep telling the story to stay awake. And so I just made up stuff about these characters. And several of the guys said, you really need to write this down. And so my parents have been very generous and supportive of my creative side of things. And so they have some timeshare points and things. They basically gifted me time in a cabin a couple of different times. I could go away for a week. And Michelle, my wife who's here, had encouraged me when I'm doing something creative to do something that was not work. You write something artistic. Like, just tell a fun story or write songs or whatever. And so I dove into this story just because it was fun, and I wrote songs connected to the story, and I just got a lot of energy for it. And so that's really what started it. But I realized writing fiction is a completely different thing, and I wanted it to be done at a pretty high level, so I needed help, and I needed to learn how to write.
You told me you were working on this story for about 10 years. So I was curious whether the original kernel of the story survived and what was the biggest change.
Yes, definitely the original kernel survived. The original kernel would be this idea that a group of seniors, people, guys in their 70s, 60s and 70s, with some college students, start making music in a garage on Basketball Street in East Nashville just for fun. The old guys are bringing their musical background and sensibilities. It's an African-American guy, Hispanic guy, a white guy, all these different musical elements. All of them were reluctant to do what they're doing for various reasons. But because the stakes are so low and they're just playing in a garage, there's no risk, really. It's just friends. And this is the kind of thing that does tend to happen. This is believable. Like, I've seen it, I've participated. The college students are based on lots of students that I've known. All of these characters are based on not any individual person, but amalgamations of people that I've known. Some from up here in Chicago, a lot from Nashville. So that original concept was this band, this accidental band, would not have come together if it hadn't been that the stakes were so low. But then, because these college students are media savvy, they're young, they're hip, they know how to use Instagram and all this stuff, this thing kind of blows up and it gets a little out of control. And all of a sudden they can't play in the garage, they can't play in the yard, they keep needing bigger places to play. And that starts to compromise the essence of what they're doing. So that main thing survived. What didn't survive was that I went and created backstories for each of the characters. Some of them were 50,000 words long. Like, I would go deep into each of these characters. That gave it a sense of place and a lot of believability, I think.
One of the things I love about the book is the way that you have painted these pictures of these pretty complex characters. An event like this is challenging because we don't want to give away the story because you need to read it. But there are these backgrounds. I mean, this story goes back generations. I mean, it takes place in a specific time that was back generations. And you and I had talked about the real people who you knew. None of them are based on real people, like directly, but that filled in the character arcs of each of these stories. Could you talk about those people you knew and how they served as inspiration?
The thing I loved about right away when we moved here to East Nashville was how the community just pulls you in to these pockets. And for me, the why, in the locker room, getting ready to work out, in the locker room, cleaning up after working out, I met some of the most fantastic people and heard their stories all the time. And I was amazed by their stories. And I was also amazed that that location, that YMCA, had been segregated in the 50s and 60s. And there's pictures. They don't run away from that history. It's one of the most integrated, fantastic communities right now, places in this whole area. But it wasn't always that way. It's progressed. So one of the characters in the story, Brother Lewis, he's not based on one person, but he's probably based on 4 or 5 people that I knew there and people I knew back in Chicago. But there was one particular guy who would sing in the shower at the Y every morning and sang so loud and really well. And one time, one of the things I did at EMI at the time that became Capitol was I had oversight of the demo studio in gospel music. And I said, man, would you ever be interested in coming over and just singing some gospel demos? Like, your voice is incredible. And he told me, no, man, I don't sing. I'm not a singer. And I was like, what are you talking about? You're an amazing singer. He's like, no, I never sing. And I just looked at him like, you're the only person that's in the shower. That had to have been you singing. He was like, well, no, I sing in the shower. I forget that the sound carries in here, but I only sing in the shower. And so for months or whatever, every so often I would try to get him to come. And so I would just get him to sing any of my gospel demos. I never was successful. In the story, I create a character that's kind of another character that's mashed up of several people who is successful in getting this guy to actually, because I always wished that guy would have. What is it in his head that gets him to think I'm not a singer? Yeah. You know, Shell and I talked about there's a lot of people who think I'm not an artist, I'm not this, I'm not that, and they've told themselves all this stuff. So I spent a good bit of time kind of meditating on that. What are the things in our head that tell us we're not something? This guy clearly was that. And then there was another guy who drove a trolley up and down Gallatin Road back in the day and told me all these stories about what Gallatin Road used to be like. And another guy who was an engineer and had a great education, but ended up, the only work he could get was as a janitor, and he ended up owning the janitorial company. You know, he was doing quite well, but it was still frustrating that he had these great skills that he could never use because he was black. And in Nashville in the 60s and 70s, it didn't matter that he had gone to Vietnam, that he had served, that he had developed all this, like good old Bible Belt Nashville just didn't have a spot for him. And so I heard these stories for years, and I just kind of turned a lot of them into, like, let's take 10 of these different people and create a person. But then I needed somebody that could kind of become, you don't want it to feel like a greatest hits. There's got to be a person behind there. So I wrote really the equivalent of an entire book on each of the main characters, and then only kept enough to make this story work.
So how many times did you write the book?
I would say, I think there's about 120,000 words in this, and I think I probably wrote 400,000 words to get to these 120,000. Maybe more.
Were you always writing toward the same conclusion? Without giving it away?
I will say that in the broadest sense, yes. People talk about this. Stephen King is one of my favorite writers, and also as a person of faith, where if you know that and then you read this stuff, you're like, oh, most people don't realize that he's a person of faith. He has talked about sometimes when you write, and if you've done a good job developing your characters, they might surprise you. They'll do something that will surprise you. And I never really thought that. I was like, wait, you're writing. How could a character surprise you? So one week I was up away for a writing retreat by myself in a cabin for a week. So part of it is like, I've just been listening to this music for a week. I've been doing all this stuff. And the Cesar character did something. And I felt like I was just typing as fast as I could, transcribing what I was seeing. And that was different than how I thought he was going to come into the story this way. But he comes into the story this way. And it was so electrifying and exciting and like emotional. It totally caught me off guard. There's a couple scenes like that where I thought I was set up. I even had an outline of like, this is going to happen, this is going to. And then as I'm writing, something totally different happens. And it really caught me off guard. The very end, I thought was going to go slightly different. And when I wrote it out, I cut it off at a different point because it felt like that was the right place to end it.
We've had so many conversations with people about what has been happening in East Nashville over the past 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, however you want to define it. And I think what you do a good job about in a story form is you don't shy away from the challenges that this neighborhood's facing, and the ways in which there's kind of good and bad on railroad tracks right next to each other or in the neighborhood. And so I wonder if you talk about that, about what is it like? I think about, there's an author named Rosalind Brown, and she talks about the importance of knowing your local manure, is what she calls it. And what she means is like your local manure is what makes the crops grow, so it's good, but also it stinks, it's awful. And so there's a sense of knowing our neighborhood that's really, really important. And I think you do that well in the story, but like, what reflections did you bring to that?
So we lived in Aurora, Illinois, which is another very challenged city, second largest city in Illinois. We lived in the worst part of Aurora, Illinois, I think. And, there was a kid killed 10 feet from our front door. And we're no stranger to bad neighborhoods. And when we came to move to Nashville and drove around, Michelle and I, was like, when we got to East Nashville, we just said, oh, this is definitely where we have to go. It's the only place we felt like our kids could grow up and feel some sense of normal. It felt more like Aurora. And also the eclectic nature. We were thinking of it more like the fact that there was still Hispanic people, Black people, white people, old people, young people, all in the same area, which is what Aurora was like. It was kind of the last gasp of that, but the process of gentrification is so hard to nail down, and I didn't want to put an easy answer to it or a bow on it. It's like, you do want to see crime rates go down. If you're a homeowner, you want to see your property value go up and not down. On the other hand, the people that lived right next door to us over in Rosebank can no longer afford to live there, and by a long margin. And so I wanted to tackle that stuff. I had a couple of really hard conversations with some people that knew a lot more about it than I did. I tended to think that arts renewal was a great thing for a long time until I got some alternative perspectives on sort of the underbelly of that. And that doesn't mean that whenever something seems to be all or nothing, or this is good or bad, we're probably solving a question or solving a problem prematurely, because we don't like to leave problems lingering in our minds.
Right.
This is just humanity, and it's just community, and that's the essence of it. And so what I was hoping to do was that there's a lot of reins in this story. There's individuals who are wrestling with that, and then there's a band that's wrestling with it, but there's also a community that's wrestling with this idea of scale. And I don't know that there's set answers, but there are individual answers. There are small answers that we can say, this is what I can do. And I think that what we tend to do is we extrapolate everything up to the biggest possible thing, and then we either despair and say it's hopeless, or we give in. Yeah. And we say, I'm just going to go with this side or that side. We just resolve it because we can't live in the tension. Whereas if we just live in the neighborhood and love our neighbors and try to exist in that tension and hang out as long as we can there, that's where real, cool, magical love things can happen.
Another tension you hinted at earlier, and that's this kind of creative, artistic tension. And it seems like in every conversation I have with artists, musicians, artists of all variety kinds, there lives that tension of authenticity, of where the art came from, of staying true to not selling out, is the way you say it. And then also then what happens when things get popular, or when things grow, or there's another scale, another level that the art goes to. I wonder if you could talk about, and I know you've lived in this tension for a long time yourself, but could you speak to that tension, living there?
If we don't start sometimes by saying, what am I actually after here, then we'll never know if we got it. And that's how I think I lived a lot of my life. And I think sometimes that's the default a lot of us I study. So we don't know if we're being successful, if we're achieving something or not. And if we don't define success intentionally, we will inherit a definition, somebody else's definition of success. And so if in this culture, in our day and age, success is usually defined by scale and profit. I mean, look at what's going on in our country right now. It used to be like, is this political leader going to tell the truth? Are they going to represent my interests? But now it's like, look how successful, look how rich they are, look how powerful they are. And I'm just going to put my trust in that because of power or something like that, and hope that some of that power benefits me. That's more a vestige, I think, of the values of our culture than it is. But I don't know that we all consciously agree with that. It just kind of seeps into us because we're the algorithms and the all of that stuff. So I feel like if we stop and talk, I had so many great conversations sitting right there at that bar with people from the neighborhood. They're friends, and they're like, well, on your way home from work, stop, and we're talking to Todd, or talking about great records, and then you realize the things that make us different are not nearly as powerful as the things that draw us together.
Yeah.
And we can disagree about different things, but there's actually a lot that we hold in common. So when it comes to music, for instance, I intentionally kind of blend music that people think are wildly different, Tejano music and gospel music and blues music and Americana and country music, and say, actually, what makes this music so powerful, when you get down to the common denominator, it's not that different.
Yeah.
And so when these people bring that together, it just creates something fun that the community latches onto. And that is honesty and integrity and community and all that stuff. And I had the benefit of traveling a little bit and going to hear this music in Mexico and hear this music in Europe. And you listen to music in a beer hall in Prague, and you hear it in Mexico, and you're like, actually, this music is remarkably similar. like how is that? Well, it's because when people get together and there's a sound to that, and it's not that different as some of the marketing people want to tell us that it is. So I tried to drill into that, but I think that honestly, music often is an excuse for us to create community. And at its best, it gets us in a place like this where we can have conversations and then take some records home and listen to them and argue about what the best song was or which the best record was. And it's still about community. It's about relationships.
If you love music, I mean, that thread, that is what the book is. I mean, it's music all the way through. In fact, not only does it talk about songs that songs were written, like the actual songs that are talked about here in this book were written alongside this book.
I wrote a couple of songs.
Yeah.
There's a couple that are finished and a couple that are in progress. Yeah, one of them's been released and it's out there. Yeah.
Oh, sweet Marianne, breathe it out, breathe it in. Don't be afraid, there's nothing to fear. You're not alone, I'm not much, I know, but I'm right here.
One of the themes that I think is just so amazing in the book is this idea of things that are fractured or broken, and then them coming together, like reconciliation of relationships, people in contentious kind of backgrounds and situations coming together. In fact, I have to confess something to you. When I first was reading this, and I think they're jamming together and they're playing together, and they all come from different backgrounds, I was like, oh gosh, this could be real idealistic, I was like, okay, all our problems are solved because we have a jam session together, and it's all, it's all good. And then the more you read it, it's the complexity comes in and it hits you. And there's a story, I'm not giving it away, but there's a family story in here that resolves at the end.
Maybe it resolves.
Ish. Okay, not resolves and not a wrapped in a bow. There's a pointer here that actually blows with tears, And so anyway, talk about that theme, how that resonated with you, and theme of reconciliation. And
I think that everybody says you write what you know, as an artist, you kind of are trying to create the world that you wish existed, as opposed to the world that it does exist. So I think that I've often spent probably more time than necessary contemplating what is the ultimate purpose of art, and bringing order to chaos, beauty to darkness, all these things, these Blaise Pascal and other philosophers of rest that did much more intelligently than I have, but I've been borrowing those ideas since I was a little kid. And so a lot of what I see, a lot of what I feel is relationships being torn apart. And it's friends being torn apart, it's parents torn apart from their children, it's generations, cultures, races. And I think there are powers that be that benefit from that and that fuel that. And then music is just another, there's something essentially spiritual about music, I think. And that it can draw people. Roger Ebert said films were empathy machines. And I love that quote. But I think music is the same thing. It's like, if you use it right, it can also be used to sell cheeseburgers, no doubt. Like it's powerful, and it just depends on how you use it. But when used properly, music is an empathy machine, just like film. That's what art does. It can bypass that rational part of your brain, the argumentative part, and you can actually have empathy for somebody else's story. And so in this, I wanted to create a problem that was a genuine problem. And it's a problem I've felt. Like it's a very close problem. It's not my exact problem, but it's very closely related to problems that I've experienced. And then not resolve it just by, we listened to a song and now I feel it. Yeah. But it does create a space in which people can make a choice to either increase their empathy or decrease it. I tried to make East Nashville a character in the story, and so I was able to say that. I sat on that bench in that corner, and I sat right there. I sat at Village Pub a lot and wrote. I sat at Mitchell Deli, and I pulled these places into the story. You'll see references to them. I sat at Retrograde Coffee, and I sat at different places. I wrote it in the neighborhood, like especially the editing times. Sometimes when you're actually like in composing mode, you got to go somewhere in the woods and like get into a zone. But when you're in editing mode, if I knew, okay, this exchange is going to happen in Mitchell Deli, there's a scene where this older guy and this college student, the college student's trying to bud the older guy into setting up a Facebook, Instagram thing to promote this, and the old guy's like, I don't want to do this. And so I set that meeting at Mitchell Deli. Nice. And, I went over to Mitchell Deli and wrote it at Mitchell Deli, right? And so I wanted East Nashville to feel like a character. I'd read Stephen King and some other people talk about making place a character. Yeah. And so I was really happy. It made it take a lot longer, but it also, I love when the few people that have read it have said, I live here in this, I feel like you got, now it's also impossible because, I forgot to do this here. I even took my dang laptop down into the Shelby Bottoms and wrote on a picnic bench thing there for a little while just to have done it, but it's like, I can't do it everywhere. But I wanted to, I feel like there's, and the other thing I noticed about it was we love Asheville, and we go to Asheville as often as we can. It's not that often. And then Asheville just went through the same kind of disasters that we've been through. And it's just heartbreaking when you see that happen. So I did pull in the 98 tornadoes play a role, and how tragedy and devastation was a catalyst for healing, and that's another thing.
Yep.
That there's other elements to that. But then what was weird was that a week or two after I finished the main manuscript, there was just tiny changes. A week or two later was when the 2020 tornadoes came true. I couldn't believe it. And then the COVID thing. And we saw the same thing happen again here that we heard about happening in 98. We were there over in Lockwood Springs, walking through people's houses with garbage bags, taking stuff out. Like, we saw it. Kids dragging wagons full of peanut butter sandwiches door to door. It's like, here it is again. This is just what. And so I wanted that to be a part of it. So I imagined some things, but I created some stories. Some of it was based on what I heard. Some was just based on what I imagined. And then a week later, it happened again. It's like this. So I feel like, that was another theme, was how does devastation and trauma, it can cause you to dive into the dark. It can cause you to leave, as if you think, like, maybe wherever I go next won't have that stuff. Or it can open you up to be more vulnerable and cause you to just rush in and help.
And where are you in this book?
Where am I? Like, it's funny. I wrote the one, like, nerdy guy that shows up backstage. Like, that was clearly supposed to be me. One of my favorite things that's happened so far is my 98-year-old grandma. My grandma read an early version of this, and she, there's a priest, Cesar's priest, it's Father Mac. And Father Mac notices that Cesar is something's going on. And he's sensitive enough to say, hey, Cesar, after church, you'll have him to get a beer and talk about it. So they go to some microbrewery in East Nashville to talk. And there's this exchange between the two of them. My grandma said when she read that, she was like, oh my gosh, I love Father Mac. I bet you John could get me in touch with Father Mac. Like, I could really talk to him. And she forgot that she's just reading a novel, that this isn't an interview with Father Mac. So for a couple of minutes, she was like, I'm going to call it that now. Yeah, problem with this Father Mac. And then she said, when she told me that, she's like, I got to laugh, John. Like, Father Mac, and he's only there for like a page or something. But there was enough there, and what it is that revealed what Cesar was going through, which my grandma could relate to. And Cesar needed to talk to him. She was feeling like, I could talk to Father Mac. Well, she goes, John created Father Mac. John is Father Mac. Like, I'm not Father Mac, but there's pieces of each of these people. And so what somebody else, the priest at our church that we go to, has also read it, and he said the same thing. He's like, I see little pieces of you in a lot of these people. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what, you don't intend to do that, but then when you read it later, when I worked on the audiobook just recently and I had to read it again, I was like, oh yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know that until after I was done. Like, there's pieces of you kind of like shards of glass and all of this stuff, Well, yeah, that is kind of like me. And it's not always the best stuff either. It's often, it's when the character does the frustrating thing. It's like, oh yeah, that's me. I'm the one that's tempted to do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
What was your favorite character to flesh out?
My favorite character to flesh out. I'll be honest, right? My first thing, I'm just going to say the first thing that came to mind is Nadia. Nadia is a character. She is in her late 60s, early 70s from New York, Greenwich Village. She is a Spitfire, super smart, product of the counterculture, and a literature professor in New York. She is being kind of pressured to move to East Nashville to live with her adult son. Like, he's not a music person, but she doesn't want to live here because she's fiercely independent and she's pissed. But she's losing her sight. I really liked her character. You talk about, like, there's aspects of it being autobiographical. I think is it Stephen King? Jan Harris here is a literature professor at Lipscomb, and I'm trying not to remind myself that she's sitting right here because it's very both encouraging and intimidating. But somebody recently in the last 2 years, since I finished the book I read, said the thing like, when you write fiction, every character is kind of a piece of the author. Was that? When I read this back, when I just did the audio and I'm reading Nadia's bites, and I'm going, oh, like there's this spiel Nadia gives about when she was young, she had prejudged people and put them into 7 categories. And I'm like, that's absolutely what I did. Like, I had totally done that. Like, I kind of very, very judgmental of like, these are the types of people, and I'm going to be this kind of person. And that's very much the way I was. And but then I make that the way she was, not the way she became. And so I kind of feel like Nadia is who I want to be when I grow up. Like, she's an aspirational character in a lot of ways. I also knew right away that there needed to be a feminine presence in this thing, so it's not just a burrow tale. And I had several women in mind that I could pattern her after. So the way that she talks and the kind of sass that she has and the everything that's not really me. That is based on us and several women that I know. And even her name is my grandma's name and my aunt's name. It's a family name, so I borrowed that from family. But yeah, so Nadia is probably my favorite one to flesh out.
My favorite character in the book was Cesar. And I was curious because you kind of touch on a lot of their backstories throughout the book, but it seemed like you took extra special care to Cesar's story and really fleshed him out really well. And I'm just curious why you felt like he was the one that really needed that spotlight.
So Cesar is a Mexican-American landscaper, and I felt like, for one thing, he needed more time because he's not someone that, well, most of my readers are not going to be Mexican, and you don't just have backhand notes that you can refer to. Jerry, the main kind of guy that gets most pages, he's from Crossville or Cookeville, Tennessee. Like, he's a typical kind of Tennessee guy. There's a lot of stuff that you can say about him, and most people will go, okay, I get it. But with a Mexican-American guy who's in his 70s, who came over in the 50s, there's a lot of stuff that we think about that's not accurate. And so there's a couple things. One is I have a whole like adopted side of my family that are from Guadalajara. And so I have a lot of history with Mexican culture that's not biological, but it's even closer than if it was. Like, I'm closer to them than I am to some of my biological family. And in fact, when I got Cesar and I got the whole book done, I sent it to one of my adopted Mexican cousins who's a regular English expert. And I said, hey, read this and call me out on anything that I did slightly off case. And my editor, even there was a couple things. Like, for one thing, at one point the guys refer to, Cesar refers to Jerry as El Güero. And my editor was like, I think you should change that to Gringo. And I was like, nah, I don't think so. We lived in an all Hispanic neighborhood in Aurora, and El Güero is what my neighbor called me. And so that's what I was basing that on. And I asked my cousin back in the day, I'm like, what's El Güero mean? And she goes, it means white guy. But not white guy like American white guy. It just means person of fair skin, but it could be an insult or it could just be neutral. And I was like, I don't understand. She's like, well, some Mexicans are from more Spanish descent and they have more fair skin, and some are from more native and they have darker skin. One with fair skin is El Güero. But when you call somebody that, it could be in the context. She goes, if he's calling you that, there's a level of affection and comfort that he feels like you're friendly with him. He would never call you that if he didn't feel like you were a friend. She said it's like something you would call a brother or I was like, oh, okay. So that's why I chose that. My editor, though, she didn't know that. She's not Spanish. And so she pushed back and said, call her Gringo. Gringo's an insult. Like, that's specifically referring to an American and all. Well, so that was an example of something where we would like spent way too much time thinking about one word, but it's like, I kind of held my ground on that word, right? But I also did a lot of research on Nuevo Laredo, which I've not been to, but I wanted it to be a border town of Texas. And the times I've been to Mexico has been in a different part, and my family, those people were from Guadalajara. So a lot of it was just research based, and the music is something I've loved for a long time. So that was a little bit easier, but then even down to the instrument, the history of the accordion, the way the accordion came from Polish and German immigrants, and I did not know how many of those immigrants made their way to Mexico. And that instrument in Mexican music is from German and Czech and Polish immigrants that went. So, do that research and pull that in there, but it makes all that stuff hopefully feel more authentic. But hopefully it also tells you something else, that a lot of us think this is like, we talk about going back to like the good old days. Well, how far back do you want to go? Like, you can keep rewinding that tape as far as you want. And Cesar, who's also Hector, like when he's in Mexico, to go back, and I wanted to deal with his Catholic roots, with the priest and with all of that stuff and the spirituality, because that gets caricaturized by a lot of Americans. And I wanted to dial, and there was a particular Spanish priest that I used to know when I was a kid, and I really appreciated the seriousness with which he approached his faith, and so I brought that in there. And so there's a lot of stuff that I wrote a lot more, and like I said, with Lewis's story and others, and I cut it out because I felt like I kept it. But with Hector or Cesar's story, it was like, this stuff was close enough that it had to stay there. And then his relationship with his wife, right, and L.A. and Boylan Heights and all that stuff. But I wanted the readers here in East Nashville, I wanted American middle-class readers, when they're hearing things about Mexicans right now that are hateful, just not true. I wanted to tell a true story. He came in 1959. He was granted amnesty by Reagan. Those are all historical things. I wanted to create that story so that people would go, oh, this is a picture of immigration that's a little different than the picture of immigration we're hearing in the news right now.
I get the impression that the essence of the book is community, but you're reading the book to find out about the inner journeys of what's revealed, or what the characters reveal to themselves by the time they get to the end of the story. Does that sound right? Or
that's a good point. Because I don't know what community is such a loaded word now. Like, what does that mean? People throw it around. It's like social media. It's anti-social.
It's polarizing concept in 2024.
I would say this, that I did feel very specifically 10 years ago, like I had tried to do what I thought were some constructive things. Like, I'm going to make a statement on social media that I think will be spiritually productive, and it'll be about something political or cultural. And it's just like putting your tongue in a fan. Like, does nobody any good. Like, nothing. And I thought, well, what could I do? And so I've totally changed, I think, how I engage with social media. Don't expect something out of it that it is not designed to do. So if you can plant a little seed, if you can make a little thing, I'll try to do it. And I still screw up about once a year and try something I can't pull off. But this was about saying, okay, can I tell a story? It's like with music, you write songs, you do shows. I've done much more of that. And that's kind of like it comes and it goes. Like, you write a song, you record a song, and it's out there still, but it seems like our people's attention spans, it just kind of comes and goes. I thought, well, could we tell a story that would welcome everybody to the table? And they could maybe identify with any number of different people in the story. But the whole point is, this community, they don't belong together. They're all from different cultures, different generations, different ages. The only reason they're even together is because of gentrification in East Nashville. That's the only reason that this old guy lives next door to these young kids. That's the only reason. Like, the fact that two of these characters have lived a block and a half from each other for 3 decades, 4 decades, they never even met each other, because in old East Nashville, the black community and the white community stayed totally separate. Now it's all blended up. Is that a good thing? Is gentrification a good thing? Property values, if you own a house, you've made a lot of money, but it's also pushed a lot of people out. So I thought maybe I could do something more meaningful by telling a story that would get people thinking, and maybe they could see themselves in here, they could see their community in here, they could do something that would be redemptive. Because at the heart of it, more than just the idea of community, is reconciliation. And it's not just sometimes it's reconciliation between individuals, people, or groups of people, or communities, but it's also reconciliation within people and themselves. It's self-forgiveness. It's inner healing.
I think if there was a final question, what does it boil down to? I'd probably want to split it in half. There's why do people need to read this book? Or maybe it's who needs to read this book. But another way to ask that question is, somebody's read this book. What do you want them to tell somebody else about why they should read the book? What do you want your readers to take away and give to other people?
I don't know how many people read books. Like, I don't know what the percentage of people is that read books. What's that? Old people. I work with college students all day, every day. And I want young people to read this. But I also created an audiobook where we worked our butts off to make it sound really good and put a lot of music in it. And so if you can't read it, listen to it. So I guess I would want people to say, some of the books that have changed my life was because somebody came along, like Rich Hollins, and said, oh my gosh, John, you have to read this book, and gave it to me or told me I had to get it. And the next time I saw him, I wanted to be able to say, I read it, and I like this part, and I don't understand this part, or whatever. And I liked to tell other people, I love this book. Like the first time I read N.T. Wright, Simply Christian, I told everybody. It was like this, okay, now this is theology. This is a breakdown you can wrap your head around. It's not so esoteric. Novels are different in that, like, when they can leave you with questions that make you want to think differently about how you live your life, what kind of person you are, and then if they can form community around the story, it's really not, it's like music in the book. And music in my life, true tunes, for crying out loud. Music was an excuse for us to get people together. I was telling Jesse this morning, like, we have a club. We put bands up on a stage. It was always totally. It's always just an excuse. It's like we just wanted to be together, and it didn't even matter how great the music was. Sometimes we would be all shocked. Sometimes it was Charlie Peacock. Sometimes it was like, oh my gosh, lightning just struck us all. And then we would sit around and talk about it, because it was really not just about the consumption of the music. It was about the conversations about what it meant to us. That's what Cornerstone was all about. It was as much about the conversations at night, in the middle of the night, about what did you see today? How are you different today than you were yesterday? That's what Cornerstone did. And so this is a story about me imagining, dreaming, kind of fabulizing, like, what could music be when we get it off of our devices and we do it back with people in space. And so this makes people say, I want to start a band in a garage with some old people like that are good players, or I just want to go hang out with people and talk. One of the best things I heard about Jesus Bread and Chocolate was when people would say, oh, I'm going through with my small group, and we baked bread and ate it and read a chapter together and talked, and eventually we forgot about the book, and it was about us in the room. So that's what I would love, is if this makes some college students go, man, my uncle plays accordion. I want to go make music with my uncle, just to actually go do stuff. That would be what I'm.
So, but yeah, you're drawing together in the book. You're drawing together people who don't naturally fit together, at least on paper. And so, if somebody says, "Who's this book going to resonate with?" It could be the same answer.
Yeah. And the slogan I put on the T-shirt at the bottom says, "We're not the band you are." The idea was, this is pushing it back out to the people, saying, instead of consuming product, produce, like, go create.
Thanks, Father Preston Sharpe, and thanks to everyone who came out for that event, and to Vinyl Tap for hosting us. It was really fun to have more than half the room full of people who had no idea who I was, what the book was about, or what we were doing there, and yet have them all get into the conversation so completely. And thanks to Jeff Elbel and the Wheaton Public Library for pulling that event together with just a couple of days' notice. Although my teaching schedule will make it harder to hit the road like I did when my previous book, Jesus Bread and Chocolate, came out, I do plan to get out there again. If you'd like for me to come to your school, church, library, bar, record store, or even home, let me know and we'll see if we can work something out. Before we wrap this up, I thought I'd give you a listen to another section of the book. This will be from the official audiobook version, which features production by Bradford Loomis, Bruce Brown, and myself. The section you are about to hear comes from the opening of the book, when we first get to know one of our main characters and we catch a glimpse of the problem this accidental band is facing. How could something as thrilling and completely unlikely as making music he loved with some of his closest friends in front of thousands of people in his own neighborhood in a way that generated real, tangible benefits for his community be filling Jerry Wesley with so many conflicted emotions and complicated thoughts? Something truly miraculous had happened, was happening, and instead of being able to just enjoy it, Jerry was racked with anxiety. The stakes suddenly felt very high. Thank God he wasn't in this alone. He ran his middle finger over the lip of a nearly empty coffee cup and stared blankly at a picture hanging on the wall of the Nashville Biscuit House. As he usually did when he felt himself getting overcome, he made his way to this spot. As hard as it would be to explain to anyone else, there was an almost meditative presence to this booth. Everything about this diner was familiar. His aging body knew the feel of the vinyl bench, the smells of coffee, syrup, bacon, and griddle smoke combined into a sort of calming incense. The kitchen workers, other customers' conversations, and the drawl of the servers cascaded over a bed of tinny WSM background music, creating a near symphony of sound. It all wove together into a multi-sensory comfort field for one of waitress Sharon's favorite patrons over the last 5 decades. She freshened Jerry's coffee with a genuine smile. "Where are you this morning, sweetie?" "Huh?" Jerry snapped back into the moment. "Oh, I'm right here. All's well. I'm just a little overwhelmed, I guess. Gotta say, I never saw this coming. I'm not sure what to think of it all." "Well, try to enjoy it a little bit," she teased. "But I don't want to see you coming in here with a handlebar mustache and suspenders anytime soon." She waved her forefinger at him. "Oh, but you do have to sign something for us." Jerry played dumb. "My check?" Sharon dropped a Sharpe and a morning copy of the Tennessean on the table and patted him on the back. Above the fold was a sweaty picture of him with a retired African-American trolley driver, a Mexican-American landscaper, one smart-looking grandmother, as well as a few college students and some other friends from the neighborhood who had gathered backstage after their inspiring concert in the park next to the community center the night before. Just above the picture read this headline: "Is this band of retirees and college students Bonnaroo bound?" Jerry shook his head and smiled. He was surprised the news of the offer was already out there. Now he had to get back to his house a few blocks away to meet the others. They had some decisions to make. He got up from his booth and made it over to the counter with a bit more of a limp than usual. His leg was acting up this morning. He figured it was probably just barking at him from overuse the night before. He paid for his meal and signed the newspaper on his way out the door. His first autograph. "To Sharon and the Biscuit House crew, keep it real, Jerry James Wesley." He was pretty sure that was really stupid. That will do it for now. I hope you dig the story so far. Again, you can pick up the book in print form or as an ebook or an audiobook, or you can get it in a combination of formats. We also made some special swag to go with it, including a ticket stub replica bookmark, some band t-shirts, and a really cool diner mug connected to the Nashville Biscuit House here in East Nashville. You can find all of that at lostperos.com right now. That's lostperos.com. Those of you who are avid Bandcamp users might prefer to check it out at my band's Bandcamp store, thewaysidestore.com. You can get the physical book or the audiobook, or both, there as well. I hope this all doesn't feel too promotional, but to be honest, this book has been a major undertaking for me for quite a while, and I'm really excited for people to check it out. Also, the work it has taken to get it designed and printed, not to mention the management of the Kickstarter campaign and various other aspects of the launch of this publishing company, is one of the other reasons I have had to take a break on regular production of this podcast. So, I wanted to pull the curtain back a bit, especially for those of you who have been so supportive here, and let you in on the process a bit. Thank you for indulging me. Again, more info, behind-the-scenes videos, and your copies are all available at lostperos.com right now.
This podcast is produced by John J. Thompson and Bruce A. Brown for Gyroscope Productions and is intended for the private use of our listening audience. The contents are protected by U.S. copyright law and are the intellectual property of Gyroscope Productions, with the exception of songs or clips that are from previously copywritten materials. Everything on this episode is used by permission or under fair use provisions. Thanks for listening. Cheers. We'll see you next time.